But if you want a high performance economy, you are going to make sure those companies in your entrepreneurship and your existing businesses have strategic competitive advantages. And by and large, the majority of competitive advantages come from innovation, having the new thing, so to speak. So without that, you're going to have very little entrepreneurship, and your existing business expansion will be weak. We know that roughly 5% of businesses, mostly small, but small, medium, and large, create all the net new jobs each year. So, if you are not focused on the kind of companies that create that sort of advantage, your growth will be somewhat lackluster. So here's some key concepts. So economies will always evolve from natural endowment. So that means agriculture, extractives, to industrial, to knowledge-based. So, Waco is somewhere in between the industrial and knowledge-based. Generally speaking, there's a lot of resistance in going from stage to stage. And why do you want to go from stage to stage? For relatively speaking, the same amount of effort, you can get greatly increasing economic returns. So education is certainly a big part of it. Talent attraction and retention is a big part of it. But by and large, innovation is the fastest path to that evolution. And because of that inertia, there is generally needed a big push, some concerted effort to build the key infrastructure and capabilities to move to that next stage. So Austin, is still not as much of a knowledge-based economy as Silicon Valley is. Everyone covets the economic power of Silicon Valley, even though we'd all like to avoid the problems there. So you shouldn't think about innovation as being the same as technology. That is absolutely not the case. It's better to think of it as new economic knowledge. How do you produce more value with, relatively speaking, the same or fewer resources? So it takes new knowledge to do that. So, supply side innovation are products and technologies that may require a great deal of complexity, but demand side innovation, knowing how to distribute something, knowing how to engage the customer better, having manufacturing capabilities, that's all part of the demand side. So, Amazon, for example, Federal Express, Walmart with their cross-docking system, like every other case in B School, is a Walmart supply chain innovation. That's insights into the marketplace. So even if you don't have all the technology, everyone can do an innovation strategy based on at least demand side, but almost everyone can get at least a start on certain forms of supply side innovation. So, one of the major tools these days, and I think y'all are talking about a tech corridor, you have the BRIC there. We've done a TARPI meeting at the BRIC. Areas of innovation are roughly 1/3 about aggregation of capabilities of talent, technology, capital, and know-how, research, and entrepreneurship and industry. But it's about 2/3 the software. That is, how do you shorten the social distances? How do you get innovations to flow? And really, an innovation ecosystem is about minimizing the time, that you go from new idea to global market dominance. So areas of innovation include innovation districts or science parks primarily. So, here is the key paradigm in all economies. So your innovative capacity, your ability to create, productize, mature, and scale new knowledge is what drives your your productivity. And competitiveness is thrown around casually as a term, but it very specifically refers to your ability to grow your productivity. So how much economic value add can we create compared to everyone else in the world? And that's really, the competition is less the next city over or the next state over, it's every other region in the world. So your ability to grow your productivity is your competitiveness. And that leads to the ultimate goal, which is prosperity growth. Now, a lot of you may have grown up with the notion that economic growth is all about jobs, but that's not the case. Job creation is a highly desirable side effect. But if you aim for job creation, you may get growth without prosperity. Prosperity, if you aim for that, you'll get a lot of job creation as the side effect. So, we measure that in rough terms by GDP per capita, or more reasonably, if the data is available, median wages, because that also gives you an idea of the equitable distribution of that wealth, and not just that it's there in the community. So that's kind of a key concept. So, focus on productivity gains, not just lower costs. A lot of people in the economic development community often tell us, well, they're trying to lower transaction costs, and that's great if it's a purely industrial economy. But if you want to get to a knowledge-based economy, it's about productivity. So what's the most expensive place to do business in the US? It's Silicon Valley. But what's the most productive place? It's Silicon Valley. So, it's not just lower costs. It's what value you're able to create minus your costs. That's really the key thing. So also the fundamental mechanism for wealth is creating value and exporting it beyond your local region. Every bank, every mall, every national chain restaurant is colonizing you and extracting dollars that go, to their headquarters, to other areas outside. And so you need to be able to do the same thing. You need to be able to create goods and services that you export beyond your local region and import capital and profits. There are other things that can distort that if you have, huge military bases or things like that. But, the fundamental paradigm is export goods and services, import capital and profit. Small businesses are important, but they do not directly create community wealth. And in fact, on average, small businesses do not grow. The small business contribution to community growth, to economic growth, is through the creation of new small businesses. But it's important for them to exist to recirculate wealth. And some small businesses can actually support traded cluster competitiveness. So I'm throwing around a few terms, but traded clusters is the term of art for the companies that are, basically exporting goods and services beyond your region. So they trade with other regions of the country. So also in economic development, a lot of places focus on cluster strategies, focus on target industries, and that's necessary but insufficient. There's a whole another world out there about making sure your cluster is systematically upgraded in terms of their competitiveness. If you're 1, 2, or 3 in the world in your sub-industry cluster, you have a lot of pricing power. That means you get better economic returns, roughly per unit of effort, per unit of input. Whereas if you have target industries, you might eventually and slowly get more competitive, but it's not as powerful as thinking through all the things a cluster needs in terms of, its supply chain, its customer base, its labor pool, its capital resources, its regulatory regime. Lots and lots of other things go into cluster competitiveness. And then build a robust innovation ecosystem tied to specific traded clusters. So this is something we see almost every place missing the boat. The innovation resources, if you just try and create one innovation center or a plan, you end up with generally lower value IT stuff and kind of weaker support for an industry. There is a unique competitive context for each industry. I mean, you can just think about it for a minute. What venture capital resources and mentors translate from the life sciences to aerospace defense? Almost nothing. Again, IT is sort of horizontal, but again, unless you plan robustly the innovation resources for a single industry, you're not going to get the rapid advancement in your competitiveness. And then, finally, aside from all of the resource aggregation and interaction, there's a quality of life dimension. So, We talk about these paradigms being 2/3 about the economic apparatus, but about 1/3, quality of life. And that's important to both attract and retain talent. We find a lot of communities obsess about their education levels, but they ignore their brain drain. And honestly, the brain drain is probably more insidious because it's, a relatively small percentage of your best and brightest that will create all the jobs that everyone else will use. So, that brain drain is a killer, and quality of life. You can attract talent through wages, but you can only keep it around in between jobs with a high perceived quality of life. And we have a lot of economists that stress about 72 different dimensions of quality of life, but essentially those 20 to 30-year-old creatives, scientists, engineers, designers, things like that, that look for high experiential quality of life. That's really sort of the key to replicating the success of an Austin or Silicon Valley. So this just most of you may be familiar with Porter's 5 forces. This gives you just an illustration. Every industry has these unique dimensions. And so, if you build an innovation ecosystem that does not take into account the unique competitive construct of an industry, you're not going to get the sort of impact that is useful. So why is innovation so powerful? It solves problems. Everyone wants to solve problems, and it creates new value. So for relatively speaking, for the same amount of effort, if you make something more valuable, all of a sudden you're more productive. Innovation, depending on the year, it can drive up to 85% of productivity and economic growth. So it's always more than 50%. So it's a very powerful force. Enrico Moretti wrote a classic book that observed that innovation-intensive industry has a 6x jobs multiplier. And then innovative firms that are mature, more than a few years old, tend to spin out 2 to 3 additional companies each year. It's sort of the Apple effect. 2 engineers at HP go to their manager, say, we want to create this thing called an Apple computer. No, we don't make Apple computers here. Okay, we're going to go start our own company. And, just like compound interest, that sort of effect snowballs. And then, the fundamental impact of innovation is you are creating a monopoly that can be protected through things like patents and trademarks and copyrights and things like that. If you want to not be completely poor, you focus on your comparative advantage. But if you want to be really wealthy, you focus on building absolute advantage. And innovation is the key way that you do that. So here are the key concepts in the innovation ecosystem, and generally this relates to the overarching paradigm. To have powerful economic effects from innovation, you are conceptually creating new knowledge in the world. You are transforming that knowledge into products and services that are useful and high demand. Then you have to mature it, which means, it has to be manufacturable. It has to be available at a reasonable price point. And then you have to worry about distribution to global markets. So that takes apparatus that only large companies have. So here's the challenge in all. Large companies have those global markets and distribution systems. And roughly 2/3 of GDP is just the Fortune 500. So unless your strategy encompasses Fortune 500 companies, it's not going to be powerful. We see a lot of places say, hey, we're going to accelerate research, or we're going to have a tech incubator or accelerator. Unless it's connected to scale, you're not going to see the value. So, when you see a highly efficient market at Silicon Valley, you are seeing a highly compressed innovation cycle. And that cycle, starts at new idea to ending at ultimate global scale. If you can do that less than 5 years every single time, you're Silicon Valley. If you're takes less or takes more time than that, then you're everywhere else. And Austin can't do that yet. But we're working on those sort of things. So this is the challenge. Researchers and entrepreneurs are efficient with regard in innovating with regard to time and money. So they can do things fast, they're maneuverable. Corporations are efficient at maturing and scaling innovation, but the incentives are almost backwards to create new innovations. It's all about maintaining an existing customer base. So if you attempt any disruptive innovation, you're going to run into maybe even career killers. So there is the researchers and entrepreneurs, as we mentioned, do innovation efficiently, but as a rule, they don't scale very well at all. So part of what is needed and part of what NSIC does is to foster relationships so that you can catalyze that movement of new knowledge from the research sector through entrepreneurship. And entrepreneurs are needed when there's disruptive innovation. Most innovation, honestly, is incremental, and that can bypass recognizable entrepreneurs. You might have an intrapreneur within a company, but it's always got to go from that new idea to productization to maturation to scale, and that's really the fundamental thing. So again, if you're working on accelerating research and catalyzing entrepreneurship, you're not done unless you are really focused on how to scale that with your traded clusters present. So it's also exacerbated that there's two valleys of death. So it's well known that the vast majority of innovations die in these two valleys of death. So one that Clayton Christensen wrote about between research enterprise and entrepreneurship or productization, and the other, the market chasm that Jeffrey Moore wrote about in Crossing the Chasm. So you have to do things as a region, as a community, to overcome those valleys of death if you want to have efficient returns on your innovation efforts. So what does an innovation ecosystem take? We're going to show kind of a picture that is useful to keep in your head as in terms of a concept. So we saw, let me go back for a minute. We see here, three major stages, but with two valleys of death. Those are basically two additional stages. So essentially you have 5 stages of innovation that you have to consider. But each of those stages require these 8 resources, but the character of these resources change from stage to stage. Talent, you require researchers in the research stage, obviously, entrepreneurs and managers. Ideas, you might have the initial idea, but there's all sorts of incremental innovation required to productize it, to reduce the cost, to make it manufacturable. About half of all intellectual property is in the manufacturing process, but it is not easily discoverable because most of that's trade secrets. If someone else infringes on your patent, because if you file a patent, everyone can see what it is, then you can't tell from the output of that they infringe. So, basically innovations in the manufacturing process are kept mostly as a trade secret. Obviously capital, there's at least 8 sub-tranches of capital between research funding and full market, public markets capital. But all of these things change character from stage to stage. And I want to mention that particular quality of place and other intangibles. That is a key thing to attracting and retaining talent. So it's hard to get star researchers if you don't have a tier 1 university. It's hard to get those young creatives for industry if you don't have that high experiential quality of life and so on. So this is what the overall analysis of an ecosystem looks like. So this is analysis that Austin did of itself when it was starting down the clean tech road. And they basically had a presentation full of lots of resources that they had to support clean tech. And I mean, there were like 30, 40 resources. And they were like, what more could we do? We're done. And so, they used this method to analyze where they were weak and where they were strong in all these different areas for clean tech. And before they started, and this is essentially, green means we've got everything we need at the capacity we need to have a robust innovation ecosystem. Yellow means we have considerable gaps. Red means we have huge barriers and everything dies at that point. So, so there's a lot of red on the government axis, which is fairly normal. You may have experienced that personally. So they predicted all this was going to be green, or the vast majority, before they did the analysis. And here showed this is what they actually have to develop to maintain a robust pipeline. Yeah, there was lots of great point activity, but if the next stage of that point activity before you get global competitive advantage out of it is that all that innovation dies, then you really got zero value out of that. So you have to keep in mind the big picture, and this gives you sort of a conceptual framework to analyze and develop your ecosystem. And again, it's important that you apply this per industry. There is no just general innovation ecosystem. So here's a good example of a comparison of a traditional economic development job creation strategy versus an innovation strategy. Who can guess what the wealthiest city in Texas through the first part of this century through 1950 was? And by the way, this is a difference of that city, which was the wealthiest, followed a pure job creation strategy. So I won't take time for everyone to volunteer guesses. It was El Paso, Texas. You can look up the data. So richer than Dallas, way richer than Austin. You can see they crossed about 1964. But Austin and other places like Research Triangle Park pursued innovation strategies. Job creation, if you don't pay attention to what those jobs you are creating attract in terms of additional population and skill levels, you can expand greatly, but then you have people that are employed, but they're not contributing as much to the tax base as they consume. And so you can actually drive yourself into poverty, and you have no money left over for quality of life sort of stuff to attract and retain talent, and you accelerate your brain drain and things like that. Also, there'll be a corollary of that. We'll come back to that. So there's a number of resources out there to quickly help you analyze your innovation ecosystem and your clusters and things like that. This is from Harvard's clustermapping.us. Anyone that is interested in cluster-based or innovation ecosystem strategies should get to know clustermapping.us, sponsored by EDA. There's another a website with some overlapping information called Stats America, but clustermapping.us is a quick way to get your cluster portfolio. You used to have to pay a consultant $1 million to write a study that would sit on a shelf. So this shows that one, your traded cluster portfolio, which is your core pillar of wealth, is a little bit lower. You'd like to see that, well above 23%. Your primary clusters, and we'd have to see how these break down into subclusters, but it shows business services, distribution and electronic commerce, which would include websites and things like that, insurance services, livestock processing, hospitality and tourism, furniture, things like that. So you would have to see, there are other analyses that talk about, which of these clusters are in decline versus growth. There's different strategies for growth versus declining clusters. This talks about the relative size. And then, basically the innovation feedstock would be, okay, if we're anything below the number three in the world in terms of being a subcluster, we have at best a price taking strategy or a capability. If you're number 1, 2, or 3, you have a price setting capability. And the goal of a cluster initiative and the innovation to feed that cluster is to systematically increase your competitiveness from, it's hard to say we're going to start at number 50 in the world and work up to number 1. It's a whole lot easier to start with what you're already pretty good at and increase that to number 1. Economic returns are proportional to your competitive advantage over your next best competitors. So again, if you're number 1, 2, or 3, you get much greater economic returns per unit of effort than you do if you're number 40 or 50. So you broaden your cluster portfolio for resiliency, but if you want economic returns, you want wealth, you deepen what you're already good at. And this gives you some data. Then in terms of your innovation advantages, and again, your innovation, if it is not feeding your traded clusters, then you're kind of thrashing. Basically, if there's a mismatch, then the innovations will go elsewhere out of your research universities or your companies to be commercialized, and your companies will starve for lack of new advantages. This website also gives you an idea where your patents are being created. No surprise there, Baylor University is number one, but this is just a partial version of that report to give you a sense, but that gives you an idea where innovation is being developed. So let's transition for a moment to the story of Austin, how we got there. So, forever, Austin was the place 20-year-olds went to retire, meaning not that they retired because they were rich, they retired because it was the slacker generation up until really the mid 80s or so. And so Austin City Council would tell you they were a bunch of hippies, and they just wanted no one to come to Austin no matter what. And that they put in all sorts of restrictive things, and there was no mass transportation and all sorts of things, like we don't want people to come here. But then after all these rankings, people started moving here in droves, so there's not very much they could do about that. So finally they embraced, okay, let's keep Austin weird. And now we're starting to do the planning that should have been done 40 years ago for a very large city. So, Austin is not unique anymore. I mean, most of the urban cores in Texas are Democratic. So Austin, stands out a little bit for that. But, here is the contribution of being in Texas. If Austin were in the middle of Massachusetts or California, it would probably be nothing special. So, there is an advantage of being that blueberry in the tomato soup. Blue City, quick to embrace new ideas, embrace diversity, tolerance, environment. There's an exercise the U.S. Council on Competitiveness uses. Close your eyes for a moment and think of the most creative person you know. Now think to yourself, is that person normal? And mostly the answer is no, they're not normal. So you need, diversity, tolerance, the environment that embraces talent in all of its forms. Also, public spending for quality of life and innovation. But the red state context also provides some useful constraints. Staunchly pro-business, low taxes, moderate, except for property tax. So, there's some challenges there. Moderate regulatory burden, tort reform, right to work state. So honestly, both sides contribute to Austin's success. And I would tell you, neither party appreciates, that the other party was necessary to make Austin a success. But there you have it. So the Austin story, University of Texas plays a key role, but sometimes it was passive rather than active. So before 1967, Austin was poor. It was very rural. We had the legislature. We had a much smaller university, and almost everyone left, particularly all the technical grads. And we had the Air Force Base, Bergstrom Air Force Base, and mostly dairy cows after that. So it wasn't until before that, the chamber sometimes got criticized for spending a lot of money on these festivals near the river and things like that. It seemed like a waste of time and money. But, the third, fourth, fifth generation of those festivals are now things like South by Southwest and ACL Live and things like that are signatures of Austin. So there was high experiential quality of life and low cost of living, but there was very high brain drain. And, underemployment meant, people that with English PhDs were waiting tables, and that may still persist. But generally speaking, people with talent were wanting to stay in Austin, even though the tech people went elsewhere. Around 1967, IBM, after 4 years of kicking the tires, decided to open what became the biggest campus in the US for a long time, hired all the UT engineers to manufacture Selectric typewriters. that was the start of the tech industry in Austin. But it was really the industrial tech. It wasn't, tech like we think of today, with research centers and entrepreneurship and things like that. And as soon as IBM did that, then there were a lot of fast followers, TI and AMD and Motorola, because of the university that was growing. But it wasn't until the 80s where we brought MCC and Sematech, where George Kosmetsky and the chair of our foundation, Pike Powers, and others brought MCC, Sematech, and that as an inducement to MCC, they added 25 endowed chairs to UT. Hey, you need all these big brains to create these international consortia that were the answer to the Japanese 5th generation project. And so that was the biggest advancement UT ever made in the rankings. So I would say, making a huge investment in your research capacity that is aligned with your tech industry, one of the best things that you could do, was really a key thing that propelled Austin. And then, as a result, from these things starting in 1983 and efforts of certain key individuals, we went from very few to 400 high-tech firms, a decade later. So core lessons: talent will move to another region for wages, but will only stick there if there's a high perceived quality of place. A stewardship organization is core to evolution. So this is a key thing. Most efforts, when they put together a group to try and champion something, it often is usual suspects. But there are a lot of parochial interests that come along with usual suspects. And a stewardship organization is carefully constructed of people who will do the right thing, even if it's not in their best interests. So the core of an organization that will transform an economy, has to be carefully constructed at the core of those stewards, people that have huge sway and influence, but everyone trusts to do exactly the right thing, even if it's not in their personal interests. Also, we talked about diversity. A key part of Austin's ranking has been cost of living, and we are losing that. So that's a challenge. And of course, we love to poke at the people in the Northeast by saying, have good weather. It's like, okay, nothing they can do there. So if you want to read more about this stuff, here's some of the key books that will talk about some of this stuff. And that's it. So we'll open it up for questions. And if I can unshare my screen, there we go.
Great, thank you, Larry. That was incredibly informative. I apologize to everyone. I actually opted to begin recording that because it is just such a wealth of information, and I didn't want to miss a moment of it. So thank you, Larry. And we do have one question here that's been posed to the community through the chat function, but I imagine there will probably be more questions as we go here. So let's start with a question from Jeremy Vickers. He has asked, and you may not know this off the top of your head, but you might actually, which traded clusters in Texas are you seeing the most venture capital investment go into?
Well, IT semiconductor, clearly, and life sciences are the clear winners. So there's some special dynamics in those industries, though. So IT semiconductor attracts the most, but it's usually lower amounts because it's less capital intensive. Life science is fewer investments, but the bets have to be bigger. So it's you either win big or lose big in life sciences. So those two are clearly the winners. I would say, there's still a fair amount of activity in certain forms of energy and clean tech and aerospace defense. The things where Texas has certain advantages. We're the home of the national defense industry. We're the home of the global energy industry. So entrepreneurs here, have scaling partners, and that's kind of an important thing. If you innovate and don't have scaling partners, your company will probably be incented to move elsewhere. So that's a challenge in building a cluster. That retention, if you're fostering innovation for which you do not have a cluster portfolio, you're really accelerating your brain drain. But the industries where there is ability to scale are good signs that it's fertile ground for entrepreneurs to develop, and VCs will invest in that. Now, I will say, as a corollary, Texas has been mostly a story of attracting venture capital from out of state. And we have dozens and dozens of small venture capital firms, but only a handful of large ones. And mostly, they're ones that have moved in office here from California in the last several years. Texas has been dropping rapidly in the venture capital rankings because we've never built our own domestic venture industry in Texas to any degree. And other states are building their ecosystems, are greatly improving their ecosystem. So venture capitalists, they don't want to get a plane to fly to Texas if they don't have to. So, we are at risk in that regard.
Excellent. Thank you, Larry. That's a great answer. And it's a word of caution. It's certainly something we need to be paying attention to and working on. And let's see. Okay, we do have a question from Mary Wentworth about the book list. Larry, if I could get that book list from you later, either you're welcome to share your screen again, or I could just send that out to the group.
Well, while we're answering questions, I'll put the book list up, but I will be glad to send you these slides, and anyone that is interested can get them from you.
Great. We'll gladly share that information. I would like to take another look at that one myself as well. I had a question, and imagine, and everyone, please ask your questions. This is an excellent opportunity to do so. You shared a slide that showed the study, the analysis that the city of Austin did for their clean tech and how it was graded, where they looked at their existing resources and their shortcomings in those areas. Was that a study that they conducted internally? Was that done through a consulting firm of sorts? How was that study conducted?
Our foundation did it, about 8 years ago for Austin. So it was using the Austin Chamber members and other folks that through their network. So, we originally thought that we could get probably a dozen folks that were knowledgeable, but it turns out in the ecosystem, everyone only has a little flashlight to see their own little area and maybe a couple of adjacent areas. So we had to go out to about 20 different groups to get all the information for that. And like I said, up until that point, the Austin Chamber had a long list of everything they had in the clean tech, and they could not think of anything else they needed to build the ecosystem. So, it kind of opened their eyes.
That's great. And future economy is a major driver for us as well. And we have a concerted effort behind that. So, just understanding that's a particular interest, I think, for our community as well. So, and I did catch your point about you can't just do this as a general rule. It's got to be for specific industries. And so understanding how to identify those industries. I know a lot of those conversations are already occurring, but that's something that could probably use a little bit of refinement as well. So definitely something we might want to be talking to you about. So let's see, we did get another question here. So this one is from Mark Reynolds. He says, we are attracting large manufacturing capacity here in the Waco. We export a lot of product outside of our area, but these operations are owned elsewhere. Are there tips for how we can encourage these external companies to invest more in this area to support economic development and entrepreneurship and innovation?
Well, the short answer is yes, but corporates will do limited amounts of things for civic interest, and lots of things if it's in their financial interests. So, obviously it's a much more sustainable paradigm if you are figuring apparatus and increments to your innovation ecosystem that will add to their bottom lines. And so that kind of thing you can sustain and scale forever. any good economic strategy is delivering value to economic participants. And again, big companies are going to get a disproportional part. So what are you already pretty good at? And what could you make a plan to extend in a way that would attract more participation, both to grow the companies you have, but to also attract. So let me say just a word about attraction. And sometimes this is a contentious point amongst a lot of my colleagues in the economic world. Attraction, as we mentioned, some cities in Texas can attract themselves into poverty. So an attraction is optimal when it either adds to your innovative advantages in a way that other companies can also take advantage of, or it is a company that most benefits from the innovative advantages you provide. Anything else, basically does not add to your competitiveness in the best case, and can actually, make your economy weaker. So attractions, need to be carefully considered, at least in the whole. I mean, any individual attraction by itself is not going to hurt you. But if you want to build an innovation ecosystem, it's like, okay, what hole are we trying to fill in our innovation ecosystem, and what kind of companies best fill that? And let's target our efforts towards those kind of attractions.
Great question and great answer. So thank you. There are a couple of things that I'll probably want to circle back with you offline, but you had shared a slide earlier that discussed the innovation intensive industries and large jobs multiplier for that. Presumably there's also a dollar multiplier for that industry as well. And so is there a way to identify what is considered an innovation industry? Is that just a generic term, or is it very specific to products?
Yeah, so there, the good news is, while people think of, well, we want tech industry, that's not really the case. You can name, except for industries, that are just in gross steep decline. The good news is that almost any industry, roughly only 10% of the companies are growing, and some of them are growing very, very fast. And so those companies within that industry are the innovation intensive portion of that industry. So as Michael Porter, kind of the guru at Harvard, says about this, it's not so much which industries you have, it's how you innovate within those industries. So innovation intensive industry really means the innovation intensive companies within any particular industry. It's not a matter of the industry itself per se.
Perfect. That makes a lot of sense. We do have another question here. This one is from Alvin. He says, you touched on innovation and its importance for prosperity. It's easy to innovate within your four walls, but are companies moving towards open innovation to further accelerate their ecosystems?
Well, many companies are. It's something that companies don't necessarily actively foster outside their four walls. So that's something that a community can help catalyze. So we talk about this innovation pipeline, and when you talk about individual innovations, because of the phenomenon of open innovation, any individual innovation can take almost what looks like a random walk through the ecosystem, maybe developed by this company and then sit on a shelf, and then some other company get a new idea for growing it, and it goes back earlier in the ecosystem. So, any particular innovation, it's not necessarily a pipeline. But when you talk about 1,000 innovations in aggregate, it looks like a pipeline of progression. In other words, you need all of those resources, because in aggregate, most of them are going to need most of those resources. So any particular company can try to meet its aims by through open innovation, trying to license innovations from other companies or from the government, or offering their innovations for license. But usually the ones that they're offering are a very passive thing. They're not trying to push that. They're trying many different ways to find the innovation they need to get a competitive advantage. And there's certain things communities can do to, catalyze that.
Great, thank you, Larry. And so that the hour is growing a little bit late, so I think we will make that the last question. But again, as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, you guys please feel free to send us an email if anything occurs to you after the fact. I suspect that there will be quite a few ongoing conversations as a result of this presentation, and just and parallel conversations that have already been occurring that can be tied into this. And it's just exciting stuff. It's great to have this energy and this intensive effort towards these goals. And so so again, send those questions to us, and we can get them to the right folks, and we can work together and make some great things happen. So again, thank you guys. Larry, thank you so much. Drew, I'm not sure if yes, you still are here. Drew, thank you for the introduction to Larry. And again, thanks to everyone for these great partnerships. And a big thanks to our sponsors, L3 Harris, McLean Intelligent Solutions, the Small Business Development Center at McLennan Community College, and Capstone Mechanical. And with that, I think we're going to call it a day. Thank you, guys.
All right. Thanks, everyone.